But when AOC started making the pivot about like we're going to talk to former ADL people about this, worrying anti-Semitism stuff, like that was a certain pivot in a way that was ducking this issue. And since then, we've seen this, and it caused me to revisit Ryan Grimm's most recent book. I don't know if
Hmm.
it's We Got People or The Squad. I think The Squad is the second one,
And it's like we've
and
got people. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, go
and
ahead.
it ends with a pretty revealing thing that I think maybe more DSA people need to
Mm,
read, which is that AOC looks back at her beating Crowley as look, it was nice to have Justice Democrats and DSA and the media come along, but she ran that campaign herself. And if it wasn't for her, it wouldn't have happened. And
mhm.
as the influence of, and as we talked about, as the sort of movement subsides, she's made clearly an opportunistic. I genuinely think like she could be looking at higher office in a way that I suspected she'd burn out before that
Mhm.
previously, but like I think she's playing a different type of game now, and it's not one that I don't think has a lot of connection to the movements, and it's sad to see.
No, I think that's actually a really good point to get to some of these thoughts that I've put together, Matt. And please jump in at any time because this is something that you and I have been talking about since we've launched Left Reckoning. Is like, what is the relationship between the socialist movement to some of these elected officials, right? Trying to map it out because it's extremely difficult. Because the ideal world is this: the ideal world is we are Matt, you and I are born into a world where in America there's an independent working class party, and we get to be members of that and fight for it to win elections, and fight for a better world that way. That's not the world that we've entered into. It might be our historic task to have to build something like that, which is why I find this moment to be so difficult. And we're in a difficult moment for a lot of reasons. One, I think that the left, and by that I mean like the democratic socialist left, the socialist movement in general, the working class movement, is very divided. And it's been divided since before this election. Frankly, ever since Bernie Sanders dropped out in 2020, there has been tremendous amounts of confusion as to where it should go next. A lot of that is because many of these figures, particularly people like AOC, had one foot in, one foot out with regards to this movement, which made it very difficult for it on the national stage to be able to chart out politics. Now, I don't want to get into too many weeds here, but I will just note one thing because every time we talk about some of the problem with the national figures, you get this kind of chorus of folks being like, "Well, this is why we need to do local politics," right? It's like, look, we absolutely should be trying to fight and win wherever we can win. But for a movement like this to be successful, we have to be able to compete at the national stage. It's just how it works. It's why with the socialist movement in the early 20th century, you had fights to win, congressional races, mayoral races, and things like that. But what really galvanized the American working class were those Debs campaigns, were those other socialist presidential campaigns. So it can't be one or the other, and it's just a
And Bernie
mistake.
Sanders,
And it,
frankly.
true, true, true. And it would just be a mistake if people say, "Oh, we tried under Bernie to do something and we lost, so now we're going to get very, very, very hyper local." That is a way to sort of condemn this movement into into multiple decades of marginality. Um, but anyways, this movement is divided because it sort of did not have that guiding post going forward after Bernie dropped out. And now, not only is it divided, it's on the back foot, as we saw with Bowman, as we saw with Bush, and as we see with the more defensive ways that people who are associated with this movement are acting right now, right? And there's this kind of false narrative that is being put out there that, well, yes, the hopes of our maybe our members or members of this movement being the standard bearers didn't end up working out, but a lot of the stuff has been incorporated into the Kamala Harris campaign. I find that to be absolutely ridiculous when you see the Harris campaign coming out and reminding the American people that the vice president, quote, no longer supports a single payer healthcare system, or other kind of things like she no longer supports a federal job guarantee. To the other reporting that we've done on this program out about how Wall Street is so invested in her campaign. The idea that this is some kind of continuation of this movement when that was a middle of the road thing, right? It's like, do you support single payer? Yes or no? You're not a part of this kind of thing, Right now, all of a sudden, that kind of fundamental plank of this movement is up to negotiation. And people used to be pretty good at seeing the difference between democratic socialist politics and this more corporate Democrat triangulation. Hell, watch the videos that you and I did, Matt, for years with Michael Brooks on Andrew Yang, on Elizabeth Warren, and yes, even Kamala Harris for a reminder of the kind of conversations that we were having back then. Whenever somebody would put these kind of pseudo progressive, pseudo left platforms out there, we'd recognize it's like, oh, wow, UBI, interesting idea. Oh, wait a second. What Andrew Yang is actually proposing is a way to undermine the American welfare system, right? People used to have a nose out for that kind of thing that I don't see them having as much anymore. And maybe that's because of a sense of despair. Um, but it's a very bad a moment when this movement that used to be kind of astute at recognizing these things is getting bamboozled all over again.
I also think there's a difference in a slightly more austerity driven neoliberal era and now our antitrust neoliberal era.
Mm,
And now people are taking that as if like these, oh, we're going after algorithmic uh price fixing in real estate equals like DSA is having some, or the left is having some kind of influence, when really like that's kind of just policy. Like that's
mhm.
policy that, I mean, you would have people like proposing that in 2003, right? Like right, like, and so like anything that's slightly like sensible doesn't mean it's socialist, right?
Mm. Yeah, no, no, and I think this is an important bit about coalitions here, and I want to get into this a little bit because maybe I've been sort of struggling over the past few weeks, to maybe to express my frustration in a kind of a productive way, let's say, and I think this is the way to sort of do it is to actually look to what you're noting there, right there, Matt, is like what is the makeup of these kind of policies, not just what is it going to do if it's put in place, but who is putting in place and for what ends. And I think maybe to get us started on the subject, there's a really great piece, and maybe we'll be able to get him back on the program. Previous Left Reckoning guest, great writer Neil Meyer, had a really excellent piece on Left Notes called "The Politics of the Three Lefts," and we're not going to read the whole thing here, but I wanted to reference it for everybody, where he notes these three different lefts: the progressive left, which that's the Jayapals, that's the Warrens, that's the Ro Khanna. Neil also notes what these people are reading, right? We might call it labor liberalism, quoting Joe Burns. This kind of progressive movement. Wants a nicer version of capitalism, right? Wants more reforms, might want some of the things that we as socialists want, but at the end of the day, they want to, quoting from Neil's piece, progressive prioritize a legislative strategy and grassroots lobbying to win reforms that will soften the edges of what some on the progressive left call, quote, crony capitalism, the goal being to save capitalism from itself. And he sort of notes its relationship to the rest of, to the international scene. The Democratic left is a second left. The Democratic left is anchored in democratic open membership organizations. The DSA is the dominant force of the Democratic left, people reading things like Jacobin in these times, labor notes and dissent. The horizon of the Democratic left is democratic socialism, a transition out of capitalism by way of a democratic road. It supports both electoral and workplace organizing to get there as popular street mobilizations. It is comfortable with more aggressive challenges to the Democratic Party, though some on the Democratic left are starting to embrace a popular front orientation, right? And this is a very in-depth piece that I highly suggest
Well,
people read.
and that's been a big shift with AOC. Like you read and you cover the coverage of her first years in Congress, and it was all like, I don't care whose toes I'm stepping on. Like she literally protested in Pelosi's office. Grimm goes into like deep detail about that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the truth is that she's not on that posture anymore, and that's just subjectively. It's not condemnation. I mean, I'm not happy about it. I'll tell you that. But it's just reality.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah. And he also notes a third left, which he calls the hard left, which is dominated by cadre organizations like PSL, Its goal is to end capitalism, but it defends the need to use authoritarian methods in the transition out of capitalism. It tends to strongly support governments in Venezuela, North Korea, and Nicaragua, among others. The hard left is totally opposed to any activity inside the Democratic Party and prefers to run independent protest candidates, but its main focus is on mass mobilization through groups like Answer Coalition that have years of experience. It shows up at all the protests, which is very, very true. And the note here is that the hard left's activist core numbers around 1,000 or so, and its supporter base must be some multiple of that. It is heavily investment in popular media could help it reach many more in the future. But anyways, the note is here. These are three different parts of what we might call the American left. And I think this is a good kind of a constellation here to understand it and to work out of it. The moment that we're in, right? Because I think that all three of these camps, I agree with Neil, all three of these camps do have different visions. And there can be coalition building and solidarity on a lot of the things that we agree on to build a strong movement. But there also has to be clear lines of demarcation between these things if you want to be successful. And as somebody, who aligns myself more along the democratic socialist model for how I want to see politics won in this country, I think it is absolutely clear here that there needs to be a line drawn within the democratic socialist movement. And what we are seeing right now, very, very clearly, is the need to have a strategic reset. A very serious look at the tactics and strategies that have gotten us to this place, both to the level where we feel that we might be able to influence politics, but then also into this kind of difficult moment of realizing, man, we feel like we should be able to influence politics, but we are seeing the weakness of our movements in being able to do that. What should we do? To get there, I think we have to dispel one massive myth that all Americans believe, and even a lot of socialists and people on the left believe, that politics is like a gradient, right? The difference between a liberal and a socialist is a line, right? A socialist, to put it bluntly, like people believe things like a socialist is just a really, really, really liberal.
The
Um,
most liberal guy, yeah.
Karl Marx, this massive, massive lib. Now, y'all probably know that that is wrong. Why? Because liberals want this nicer version of capital, right? Be it the progressive one, or even just like, what maybe a Bill Clinton or somebody like that believed in, that if, there's more economic stability and wealth in the country, that, yeah, there'll always be some people at the bottom, but the bottom will be nicer, right? Well, socialists absolutely refuse that model. They recognize that the entirety of capitalism as a system is predicated on the exploitation of the masses, that is, the working people. And we have a fundamental commitment not just to eradicate some of the rougher edges of the system, but to create a radically new, different system built upon the ideas of democracy, of freedom, and of breaking the domination of certain people by others, right? That's a fundamentally different commitment than somebody like an Obama or Nancy Pelosi has, right? So the gradient model that a lot of people consider to be, that's how politics works, is just absolutely wrong. And it's the same thing between progressives and democratic socialists. And this is what I want to get to here, Matt, is because I think a lot of people, and I think this line has become extremely blurred over the past 4 years or so. And I think it's exceptionally so over the past couple of weeks, right? If you understand that a socialist is not just a super liberal, a socialist is also not just a super progressive, right? Because a lot of people will say things. Well, what's the difference between people, comrades and friends of mine who might be more progressive will say, oh, we sort of want similar things. We just have a difference of opinion in how to get there or how to achieve our goals. No, socialists want to see a fundamental rebalance of power. Um, not for some kind of nicer version of capitalism, a world where you still have to work to make your boss rich, but might not just be one check away from starvation, right? That's a nicer version of it. That's the progressive version of capitalism, but that's still capitalism. It's still a system that is predicated on the exploitation of American workers, on the exploitation of the global South, and of fundamental non-democracy at the workplace, right? We want working people to be in control of their own lives, to be able to enjoy the bounty that they create, not ship it off to some rich asshole, right? And that's a fundamental political difference. That's not just a difference of how we get there. Those are fundamentally different goals. Now, again, a progressive might want a higher minimum wage like me. I'm very happy to work with them and all that, right? I count many progressives among my friends. But this blurring of these lines between this politics can get really, really dangerous when we start thinking about how to articulate and fight for our kind of politics. Um, because what we're getting now, what socialists are being sort of challenged with, called to, is how we get there, right? So, what we're getting if we criticize Kamala Harris and what's going on within the current Democratic National Convention and some of the rhetorical moves that we're seeing from Democratic Party officials is, oh, you're so upset because you're getting just a little bit of what you want and not the whole thing. And now you're throwing a fit like a child, right? Just an absolutely please jump in if you want to, Matt. But it's
Well, I mean, this was the beginning of my political consciousness. The same thing happened under the first Obama term. When people started criticizing Obama's economic policy, they were called emo progs. um, if you were like, why are you complaining about,
oh my
him
god.
doing this sort of drone policy? Or why, you have a problem with him not doing the mortgage cram down and helping Americans. Well, that's tough and it's really complicated, this economy stuff. So why don't you just cry about it? That was the attitude taken in 2009.
No, and it, Matt, not to for us to be old guys, we're both just like in our early 30s here, but it is like a little bit of historical memory will go a long way in sort of understanding how we're not seeing something particularly new. We're seeing very much a continuation of an old argument. The difference is that our movement, the socialist movement, is larger, has more potential than it has in a very, very long time, which is why I have no interest in sort of selling it or seeing it disappear so cheaply, right? So one of the things that we have to be asking ourselves here, when we get sort of challenged by even good, well-intentioned friends and comrades on this, is to ask ourselves these kind of fundamental political questions, because not only do we have different goals than the progressives or the liberals when it comes to politics. Well, we have a different belief in the strategy of how to get there, right? Progressives believe in a kind of pleading dynamic with capital and with the state and with the Democratic Party, being a junior coalition partner of the Democratic Party, so that, yes, every once in a while we'll sprinkle some kind of progressive policy here and there. Socialists believe in working class independence and in working class power, and in building up the capacity of the working class to be a force on the political scene so that it has its demands met. Now, there's a lot of different ways to get there. The conversation, I think, is beyond the scope of this one today. But the fundamental conversations are still the ones that we've been having for the past few years. How can we build pre-party formation for a working class movement? How can we build a united working class movement? How can we create politicians who are connected to the movement, who are class rooted, not class focused? Matt, it's probably been a long time since I've said that on this program, right? But that's one of the fundamental distinctions. And just really quick, the distinction between being class rooted and class focused is absolutely critical. Class focus is where you do things like talk about the working class. Hell, that's something the Democrats have been doing for a really long time. They'll say, "Oh, we believe that working families should get taken care of, whatever." Right? Versus being class rooted. Being class rooted is being of the class, being the articulation of a working class kind of politics, being connected to the base, understanding exactly what the working class wants. To give a quick example of this, you could see this with a political movement like Syriza in Greece, the radical left party that came into power in Greece in 2014. That was like the big hope of in 2015 was the big hope of so many of us, before Bernie and all these kind of movements. Well, you had a lot of left wingers who were very, very correct in sort of pointing to things that they'd like to see in Greek society and all of that. But when it came time to sort of facing down the European Union and the deep state and the financial class, they were unable to sort of mobilize, the working class or prepare it in the way that would be necessary to take on that final confrontation, and ended up completely capitulating to the EU. Right? That was an example of a kind of class-focused politics and the dangers that could come out of that kind of politics. We need very clearly in this country independent working class formation, either in a party or an organization. And what we're getting right now from a lot of people on the left, from a lot of people on the progressive left, even people who might call themselves socialists, is not kind of conversation about how to build that kind of organization or that movement. It's all this kind of coalitional strategy, right? Oh, yeah, we can build this coalition, that coalition, wine moms and labor leftists. That kind of politics is no different strategy than every goddamn political pundit in the United States of America since the beginning of the mass media. No different from Karl Rove or James Carville when you start talking about politics in that way. And socialists have to fundamentally think about politics differently. So, in closing, I'll just say this: our movement is on the back foot. The past 4 years have been extremely difficult. And what we're seeing right now is this progressive side of our movement, the lines between that democratic socialist line and that progressive side have gotten extremely blurry. And we're seeing a lot of progressives, a lot of people who had a hard time telling the difference between a Bernie Sanders and an Elizabeth Warren a few years back, wanting to re-enter into the Democratic Party mainstream. And to do that, they're going to feel the need to excise this dangerous and rowdy membership of the left, right? So they'll call, democratic socialists things like unserious or joy killers, right? And you could see this in the kind of cognitive dissonance right now, where so much of the talk about Kamala Harris is this mental health language. It's like, oh, I need to feel joy, I need to feel relief, all this kind of stuff. You need to find that kind of peace in your life outside of politics, friends, because there's a long fight ahead of us. Now, on the democratic socialist side, it's extremely difficult too, because we're going to have to navigate our way out of this. We're going to have to think differently than just not participating in politics, which is a tendency that we're going to see so many calls for the next few weeks. Right, Matt?
Because I was just going to say, like, I think there's a huge contingent of especially younger progressives who might like develop along the lines on the Israel, on say question of Israel Palestine, but not in the way of like a socialist,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like become like, and it'll be some that as like a radicalizing moment, or whether it's this abortion stuff too. You'll develop sort of more progressive types folks, but it won't be with that ideological bent.
No, I mean, and seriously, and this is one of the difficulties that we have when we don't have that national project. We don't have that kind of electoral project to give people the kind of sustenance that is necessary to sustaining a long term left wing democratic socialist movement in this country, right? So non participation is not an option. Turning your back on the entire democratic socialist project is not an option. Um, you know, so we're going to have to engage with politics in a way that actually is able to build independent socialist working class power, right? Not a transactional temporary arrangement that means muting and diluting our demands for a better world, right? And that's a difficult task, right? I don't have the answers as to how to do that in this moment, right? That is something that is going to have to be constructed together. But what I would implore our friends and comrades and listeners here is to ask yourself those questions. Is what we're doing building working class independence and working class power? Or is it just engaging in transactional politics that are benefiting, in many cases, class enemies, enemies of working class people? Right. And we should be very, very serious about, the role that we're playing in American politics, because you don't want this movement to be regarded in a similar way to how Obama, um, what Obama did to so many people who got engaged and involved in politics during the Obama years, right? Where they had a lot of hopes for the future, a lot of ideas that things were going to change. They became extremely disappointed and they became disengaged because of that, right? We're very close to seeing something like that potentially happening with our movement, without even having the opportunity of getting our guy in power. So I hope to be along the ride with all of y'all, building, and figuring out some of the answers to these questions. But this is, I think, very much, a very, very dangerous time that we have to take very seriously.
David Marcus, a literary editor for The Nation, tweeted this. I thought it's a good little snapshot of kind of what we're talking about. Sean Fain speaking about the working class standing up in front of a campaign slogan that reads "Strong middle class, strong America," tells you everything you need to know about. He says why writing history in America is hard, but exactly, and like I
That's
noticed I want to be fair. Some people got on because AOC did use the term working class in her speech. The clip that I saw, it was her saying middle class,
She
and I
did.
don't
She
like that.
Yeah, I don't
So
like it
yeah.
either. It's really bad. I mean, but that's become the kind of theme of the Kamala Harris campaign, is like, working class values. That's a very different. Sorry, Jesus Christ, I don't even have it in my my mental map to say that. Um, they keep on saying middle class values, right?
Well, you knew. I mean, FT Signifier had a good thing on Kamala. It's that's going to be it's bougie politics. Yeah, once you get like all these like dude bros for Harris and women for Harris. It's never like working women. It's not,
Mm.
never like people with a bunch of credit card debt because they've been spending on essentials. They put in diapers on it for Harris. It's always like people who can spend a lot of money to fund some campaigns for Harris.
Yeah.
But